On this, our final edition of the Correspondents, the violence following a white nationalist march in Virginia exposes deep racial divisions in the country. Is President Donald Trump making it worse? The U.S. Secretary of State says Washington is prepared to start dialogue with North Korea after Kim Jong-un backs off on his initial threat against the island of Guam. And excitement builds for a major celestial and scientific event next week when parts of the United States will see day turn into night. A rare sight indeed. And to our viewers and listeners around the world, welcome to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. We begin with the issue that has gripped the nation for much of the week: the rise of the so-called alt-right, white nationalist groups in the United States. President Donald Trump found himself in the middle of a political firestorm after shifting his position several times on who was really to blame for the violence and death that ensued in Charlottesville, Virginia. VOA senior national correspondent Jim Malone has our report.
Wait a minute, I'm not finished.
In his feisty exchange with reporters at Trump Tower, the president insisted that both sides were to blame for the violence in the Charlottesville protests.
I watched those very closely, much more closely than you people watched it. And you have, you had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. And nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now.
Trump's comments were denounced by Democrats and by several Republicans, including House Speaker Paul Ryan, who argued on Twitter that white supremacy is repulsive. There can be no moral ambiguity. Republican Senator Cory Gardner spoke at a town hall in Colorado.
The KKK, the neo-Nazis, and the white supremacists, like I said earlier, go back to your cave.
Republican National Committee Chair Ronna Romney McDaniel defended the president, even as she denounced far-right hate groups.
We don't want your vote. We don't support you. We'll speak out against you. The president has said so, the vice president.
On Monday, Trump denounced racist hate groups after he came under tremendous pressure to revise an earlier statement on Saturday that condemned the violence on many sides.
And for more now on the growing racial divide here in the United States, we are joined in Washington by VOA national correspondent Jim Malone, who filed that report for us, along with VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman. I thank you both for joining us. It's been certainly a busy week. But Jim, first question goes to you. It took the president, less than an hour to respond to condemn the Barcelona attack by car. It took him much longer to respond to the similar attack, to the same kind of attack in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm wondering, does that suggest that the president may have a blind spot, perhaps, for domestic terrorism?
It's certainly been the subject of quite a bit of divisive debate this past week. Mill, this has been a disturbing week on a number of levels. The images from Charlottesville, the Torchlight March, the horrific use of a car as a weapon of mass destruction resulting in the death of a young woman. And then, of course, the president's vacillating comments about where he sees the blame, culminating with his decision to go back on his original gut-level reaction, which was both sides were to blame. I think this has set off a political firestorm, and I'm not sure where this leaves us. I do think it casts a bit of a pall over his presidency at the moment.
And Steve, to Jim's point, this was really quite a disturbing kind of unscripted press conference for the president. A lot of people I saw shaking their heads. Do you think GOP lawmakers are confident, or are they disturbed by what they saw?
Yes, they're in private, very disturbed. In public, while there have been a number of senators who have put out messages decrying bigotry and racism, only a few mentioned the president by name. I think the most significant statements that we've had, one from Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee, who questioned the president's fitness for office. This is someone who had been vetted by the Trump campaign to be a cabinet member or vice president. Also, the former 2012 Republican nominee for president, Mitt Romney, saying explicitly that the president must apologize. Of course, I don't think anybody around the president expects the president to apologize, however.
I think what disturbed a lot of people the most was the president seeming to go out of his way to imply equal blame on both sides. In fact, I think we have a soundbite of that where the president sort of speaks to that. So let's have a look if we have that soundbite, and I'll talk to you guys.
Not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch.
So, to both of you, who are these fine people that the president is talking about on the alt-right, the neo-Nazi, the white supremacist side?
Well, I think this gets into an issue of the president very careful to nurture his base voting bloc.
It's politics.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent. I want to say something else, though. If you look back the last three presidents, President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton, they all had their moments when they were on the stage in terms of a national tragedy, and they chose to go down the path of healing, whether it was Barack Obama in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, the terrible events there, George W. Bush after 9/11, Bill Clinton after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. These are always tests for a president to step up to the national stage. Are you a uniter, a healer, or do you go in a different direction? And a lot of people are criticizing the president for these remarks because it seems like it worsened the divide in the country and made healing more and more difficult.
Trump essentially deepened that divide. In fact, the only praise that we heard came from some of these white nationalist groups,
David
right?
Duke, notably a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and a former candidate for Congress. And as we've said, really no one else has come out to defend the president. The members of his cabinet have been mostly silent. White House officials are not commenting about this. And I think what was also very notable were the statements from the chiefs of the various branches of the armed services putting out messages that they will not tolerate racism in their forces, and that is very notable.
The group that seems to be showing the most leadership seems to be the business community, the president's advisory council on manufacturing.
And we had a typical, I guess, presidential Trump reaction on that, where he decides to disband these three councils rather than endure any more resignations in protest. You know, this is a very test for him in terms of loyalty. He always sees it in terms of personal loyalty. Right. And so far, we're not seeing anyone step away from the administration, even though we're hearing that there was tremendous pressure on some and soul searching going on within the White House. But that's not evidenced in terms of action yet.
Well, as Mitt Romney said, he believes that we are at an inflection point. I think we hear that sometimes week after week. A
little bit too often
some people.
But this seems
this does seem, yes.
Yeah, Congress has been largely silent. Obviously, they're in recess. But do you expect that there will be more of a drumbeat of opposition after they come back in September?
I think in relative terms, we've heard more from Republicans. It is increasing a bit. Many of them are still reluctant to be that demanding on camera, to go after the president by name. They still fear that he could rev up his base against them. It's a gut political instinct and calculation that they're making. But this does portend perhaps difficult times in September when Congress comes back and they have to deal with some very serious issues, the budget, debt ceiling, and so forth.
Watch the Republican senators. That's really the key. They are not under the same sort of pressure that a lot of the members of the House are, who are in a very pro-Trump Tea Party congressional
And they
district.
used to fear attacks by the president, like Lindsey Graham. I'm not sure they fear it as much.
There seems to be less of that, right?
Yeah, I do.
And the president seems to be sort of deflecting some of this by talking about the removal of statues as being the real issue, Confederate statues.
Certainly, and he'll deflect and try to distract, I think, next week to something completely different. Stay tuned, as they say.
Yeah, stay tuned, as they say. Jim Malone and Steve Herman, thank you very much. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un decides not to launch missiles into the island of Guam. Does that mean diplomacy is still alive? That's next. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better.
The technology that we have developed is quite safe. One day, these technologies could help to save the lives of many, many people.
Professor Juan Carlos Belmonte with the Salk Institute talking about the fast-moving field of gene editing. Recently, U.S. scientists made headlines when they reported they'd succeeded in altering the genes in a human test embryo to repair a common but serious heart defect.
There is around 10,000 diseases that are caused by just a mutation in one single gene.
Belmonte cautions that gene editing is in its early stages, and scientists are proceeding cautiously to make sure it can be applied safely. But he says he believes the technology has brought science to what he calls an important moment for human health. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
Welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, the world is breathing a bit easier this week after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un postponed his plans to fire missiles aimed at the U.S. Pacific territory of Guam. Now, the cancellation of the missile launch appears to have opened the door for diplomacy. This week, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson suggested Washington was indeed open to the idea of talks between the U.S. and North Korea. We'll have more on that now from our State Department correspondent, Cheng.
The escalation of the confrontation between the United States and North Korea was put on hold Tuesday after Kim Jong-un delayed the decision to fire missiles towards Guam. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says the next step is up to Kim.
We continue to be interested in finding a way to get to dialogue, but that's up to him.
But the U.S. also says Pyongyang needs to stop ballistic missile and nuclear tests before negotiations can begin on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
North Korea would have to take some very serious steps and show us that they are serious about its interest and intent in denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. They would have to do a lot more of that.
The pause in the standoff does not mean the military option is off the table. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis says Washington remains ready to defend itself should North Korea proceed, after all, with the missile attack on the U.S. territory of Guam.
And for more now on the latest diplomatic overture, we are joined here in our studio by VOA State Department correspondent Cheng, who filed that story for us. Thank you for that. And by our national security correspondent, Jeff Zeldin. I thank you both for joining us. So, Nike, good report. What would it take to get both sides talking peace? What does the U.S. want from Pyongyang?
I think the ball of the talk is on the court of North Korea. U.S. is open to talk, but U.S. will not talk for the sake of talking. So North Korea needs to take concrete action to show its good faith. So for now, I would like to share the op-ed by Secretary Rex Tillerson and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, which is a very good reflection of what's the thinking of this Trump administration. So Mattis and Tillerson said that given the record of North Korea being dishonest, a good sincere indication would be the immediate cessation of the nuclear test, the missile launch, and any weapon test.
So a complete cessation of the North's nuclear ambitions. Is that something Pyongyang would ever agree to, Jeff?
The view of intelligence officials is that Pyongyang isn't going to go in that direction anytime soon. They look at Kim Jong-un and how he's played his hand on the world stage. And the things that jump out at intelligence officials is that, first of all, clearly he still wants recognition. He's not afraid to rattle sabers as his father and his grandfather before him. He's not afraid to engage the U.S. in a little verbal tit for tat and ramp up the tensions that way. But they also say when they look at his actions, it's clear that he knows what, at least in this way, he's a rational actor on the world stage. He knows what his goals are. He wants recognition for North Korea as a nuclear power. And also, he wants to stay in power. So, and he looks at history. He looks what happens to other leaders on the world stage who have given up weapons of mass destruction, like Libya's Gaddafi. And what happened to them? They're no longer around. So they don't see him giving up nuclear weapons, giving up his missile tests anytime soon.
So, Nike, do you think that is the reason why North Korea perhaps blinked when it came to actually their promise to launch missiles against Guam? They obviously didn't do it, much to the relief of a lot of people. But is that perhaps the reason why North Korea decided, okay, we're going to step back on that threat?
I think analysts will tell you many factors involved. Number one, the very strong message from this administration. Any diplomacy need to be backed up by a very strong military option. And by yesterday, when Mattis and Tillerson met with their Japanese counterpart, that message is still, military option is still on the table. That's one. And number two, the increasing cooperation from China also play into the factor.
Nike, can we do this without China's help, or is China kind of integral to any kind of peace talks that go on between the United States and North Korea?
U.S. cannot do this alone without any cooperation from China. So what we see this international campaign of putting more economic and diplomatic pressure against North Korea, what's so different is the intensity of this campaign, the unity from the international cooperation, and the level of cooperation from China.
So, Jeff, besides the threat coming from the U.S. president, does the U.S. have any bargaining chips? I know there's war games taking place next week, scheduled war games taking place next week. Could that perhaps be a bargaining chip for the United States to sort of postpone or delay that?
Well, the U.S. is always trying to send a message with its military posture. And if you listen to top military officials, including Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, they've been quite clear. The military option is on the table. Is there a military solution? It depends on what you see as a solution, but the U.S. is quite confident that should there be a conflict, it's a conflict that North Korea would lose. Is that where the U.S. military wants to go? Is that how they'd like to resolve it? Absolutely not. The military has been adamant that this needs to be a diplomatic effort and a diplomatic solution, but they said they're quite clear that if there's enough of a provocation, if there's a missile launch toward Guam, that's an act of war, and they will do what is necessary.
I'm going to press back a little bit on that, Jeff, because Steve Bannon did this unscripted interview recently where he essentially undercut the president's military theme by saying that he sees no possible way of launching any kind of conventional military attack without seeing the loss of as many as 10 million South Koreans.
Military officials, I don't know if they'd agree exactly on the numbers, but if there is a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, it will be bloody. It will cost many millions of lives, to say the least. And that's why they don't want to go down that path. But they also want to, the message that they're trying to get to Kim Jong-un in North Korea is that if North Korea decides to push it to the point where that becomes inevitable, where that becomes really the only option, North Korea is going to lose. And the reason that they're sending out that message is the one thing that's quite clear about North Korea and Kim Jong-un and his regime is that his key goal is survival of the regime. Mm-hmm. And the message they're trying to send is, if you push us to the brink of war and over that brink, you will not survive.
Nike, as a State Department correspondent, I know you've been covering Rex Tillerson since he was appointed to Secretary of State. Does the president's impulse to tweet impulsively, how difficult does that make Rex Tillerson's job?
He is being a top diplomat. Of course, his wording is very diplomatic.
He's kind of the good cop versus Trump's bad cop.
Well, any diplomacy need to be backed up by a very strong and then concrete wording, and which we never seen the tweets before. The previous administration do not use a tweet, and now tweeting become a tool to implement the strategic accountability against North Korea, and then so in public. Rex Tillerson, of course, he did.
It makes for a difficult job for the Secretary of State. Indeed. Jeff, last question. Does the U.S. have any good military options available to it?
Well, the U.S. has options. It has missile defense systems that it's been testing that can shoot down some of the missiles that North Korea has been launching. It has very capable forces in the region. They've been doing more exercises with South Korea, with Japan, to make sure those forces are ready. It's not an option the U.S. wants to use, but it's available if needed.
And I know it's an issue you two will both be covering and watching very closely next week. Thank you so much, Jeff Zeldin and Nike Cheng. Time now for another quick break, but when we come back, a once-in-a-lifetime event next week will have many scientists and Americans craning their necks to the sky. We'll tell you what that's all about in our final segment. But first, a reminder, we'd love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better.
A total solar eclipse will happen August 21st and will be visible across all of North America. Millions of people will watch, but looking at the sun without protection can cause eye damage and requires safety glasses, such as those made by the NASA-approved American Paper Optics Company, whose president is John Jarrett.
In an hour, we can manufacture more than 50,000 glasses an hour from start to finish.
NASA officials say homemade filters or sunglasses are not safe for eclipse viewing, but for those that will see the event, it will provide quite a thrill, says NASA scientist Michelle Thaler.
You can feel it coming, you can feel the temperature dropping, you can feel things changing and getting very strange.
NASA experts say another safe way to view a solar eclipse is through pinhole projection that shows a reflected image of the sun and doesn't require looking directly into the sun's rays. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, in just a few days, on August 21st to be exact, Americans who live along a narrow band from the west coast to the east will experience a celestial spectacle few people will ever experience. A total eclipse of the sun, which is essentially what scientists say happens when our moon passes between the sun and our planet. Now, while that kind of sun and moon conjunction isn't all that rare, what is rare is that this eclipse will be visible on land across much of the United States. Our science correspondent George Putich explains.
The moon covers only about a half a degree of the entire sky, so its shadow has two parts: the umbra, where the total eclipse can be seen, and the penumbra on both sides of umbra, where the eclipse is only partial. This umbra will be about 112 kilometers wide and will travel across the U.S. at approximately 2,400 kilometers per hour, giving between 2 and 7 minutes of observation. Scientists are excited about this rare opportunity to study the sun's corona, the aura of plasma that surrounds our star.
It's not very bright, so we usually can't see it, but during a total solar eclipse we can. And this is where all sorts of dynamics, magnetic explosions occur. The corona is incredibly hot, and we don't understand why that is. It's what I study. And so we want to understand all of these dynamics that are going on in the sun, because the sun, of course, affects us here at Earth, and it affects all of the planets in the solar system.
And to tell us more about the great solar eclipse of 2017, I'm joined by VOA science correspondent George Putich, who gave us that fine report, and by VOA News Center's Carolyn Presutti. I'm so glad you two could join us. I'm excited. Are you guys?
Very much so.
Very much, yeah.
So,
it's going to be a great event.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are looking forward to it. George, so you brought us like a little show and tell here. What's with the cereal box and the sunglasses?
The cereal box is to show that it's very easy to
show it to camera 3 so our folks
It's very easy to create a little sort of a pinhole camera to watch the eclipse, because it's extremely dangerous.
So you're
to watch
saying
it
that
directly.
becomes a pinhole viewer?
Exactly. If you cut any box like this, make a pinhole here, and the sort of opening through which you can watch at the bottom, and put a piece of white paper
and you can
on
see
the bottom, you can actually look at a very,
camera
very
obscura is what that is.
a very nice picture of the eclipse. And what's even better, you can take your smartphone and make a video or a photo, because for smartphones it's also very dangerous to point directly to the sun. It can burn.
So Carolyn, why is it so important for us to be wearing these funky glasses while viewing the eclipse?
Well, these are geeky glasses, right? But you really do protect your eyes. Oh, come on.
It looks great on you. I love it. Okay.
But you have to, because the sun is so bright, but that you can't stand and look at it, right? But you'll be tempted to, right? Because
you could go blind. Is that what it is?
Absolutely. A man in 1963 went partially blind, still is, because he looked at the sun for 20 seconds. So it's very damaging.
So be forewarned. Anybody who wants to view the sun during the solar eclipse needs to wear some kind of protection or build a camera obscura device like yours. Now, George, obviously the entire scientific community is abuzz about this eclipse. I mean, but like you say, it happens quite often. Why is there so much interest in this particular?
Because first of all, it is a total eclipse. which means that the moon will totally cover the sun and only its corona will be visible. Now, as you can imagine, even with sophisticated instruments from the Earth, observing the sun is very difficult, especially the corona, which is a very interesting area of the sun's atmosphere, because what science still doesn't know is why is corona about 1 million degrees, 1 million degrees hotter than the sun's surface. So blocking of the sun will enable scientists to look only at the corona and put all kinds of spectrometers looking at it and trying to find out what's going on in that area of
And why is this such a big deal for America? This doesn't happen all that often here.
No, it doesn't. And you know, 12 million people are right in the line of that perfect eclipse arc that George is talking about. 12 million people. But you know, we're all geeks at heart, right? So we all want to know about the universe. We want to know where we came from. We want to see the eclipse. We want to learn about the sun. I mean, there are all kinds of experiments going on all over the country.
So if you're not in that area, how can people sort of experience some of that thrill?
Well, we'll be going live on Facebook.
Oh, yeah?
We'll be going live in Los Angeles with an observatory in Missouri where they're sending balloons up to do a 360 video of the eclipse. Wow. I'll be live at the Air and Space Museum. I'll be live in Northern Virginia at George Mason University. They have an eclipse mob. So 150 people have these receivers to pull down the radio waves, low frequency radio waves, to test and see how the sun affects the ionosphere. So there you go.
And if I may add, NASA also has a very, very good website at nasa.gov where people can watch from all over the world.
But make sure you tune into VOA News because we're going to have the full coverage here as well, right?
We definitely are, yeah.
Because we're linking to NASA as well, aren't we?
We are, and they'll have a live
And you'll be
stream.
talking to scientists as well?
Absolutely. Scientists and just individuals out to see the eclipse and how they're viewing it. And of course, everyone will have these on.
So George, I'm actually traveling to South Carolina on Monday to see this for myself. I've seen partial eclipses, but never a total solar eclipse. What can I expect to see?
You can expect to see something once in your lifetime because it's a fantastic. I remember when I was very small, I watched the total eclipse in my home country, Yugoslavia, and it was absolutely fascinating. It's something.
I hear the temperature drops.
In the middle of the day, suddenly it becomes night.
It's dark.
You can see stars.
Birds go to roost.
And
all
it's
that
going,
stuff.
yes, it's going to be very interesting to watch animals.
I can't wait to talk to you guys about it on Monday, but we are out of time.
We could talk about it forever.
We could. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you so much, George. And of course, all our correspondents today. And I just wanted to say thank you one last time to you, our viewers, and our listeners around the globe who tuned in each week to the Correspondents. Sadly for me, this is our final episode. But before we go, my sincerest gratitude, of course, to our talented and dedicated correspondents all over the globe. You've made us all very proud. And to everyone here who labored behind the scenes, you know who you are, just outside of camera range, always helping us out. Thanks for looking out for us. You know, we've had a very good run since 2014. Nearly 200 shows altogether, talking about issues rarely covered by other news organizations. That's something we're certainly proud of. But in the end, none of it really would have mattered without you, our audience. I hope the Correspondents has given you a better understanding of the world we live in, and I hope you've enjoyed our discussions as much as I have. Of course, you can still keep pace with what's going on around the world. All you got to do is just go to voanews.com. But do drop us a note if you can. We are still on Facebook and YouTube at VOA The Correspondents. But for me, that's it. I thank you for watching. I'm Mil Arcega signing off one last time. So for now, so long from Washington.